The clock on the wall measured the silence in the office, one steady tick at a time. Mark sat at his desk, the screen of his phone glowing against the dim light of the room. He tapped the banking app icon, his thumb hovering for a split second before the interface loaded. The number appeared in bold black digits. $240,000. He exhaled, a slow, controlled release of breath. 15 years of tracking every cent, every grocery bill, had led to this specific total. He leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking in the quiet. To him, the screen represented a fortress. He scrolled through the transaction history, watching the steady, incremental growth of the last decade. Every entry was accounted for. He felt the weight of the phone in his hand, a solid, tangible anchor. He smiled, convinced that his careful hoarding had secured his future. He only looked at the balance, convinced that the number was the ultimate measure of his success. He was safe, and he was completely wrong. Across town, the atmosphere was entirely different. Sarah sat in a high-backed chair. The air in the bank manager's office chilled to a precise, sterile temperature. Before her lay a stack of documents, the edges crisp and sharp. A single line of text stood out, $1 million in principal. The manager sat opposite her, his hands folded neatly on the mahogany surface, waiting. Sarah reached for the pen. Her fingers brushed the cold metal barrel, and she felt a sudden, sharp tremor in her hand. She pulled it back, resting her palms flat against the cool wood. The silence in the room was heavy, punctuated only by the hum of the ventilation system. She looked at the signature line. It represented a debt that would dwarf her current income, a leap into a reality where she would owe more than she could ever hope to save. The risk was not abstract. It was a physical pressure in her chest. She took a sharp breath, the sound echoing in the small space. She gripped the pen, her knuckles turning white, and prepared to close the gap between her current life and the one she intended to build. The pen tip touched the paper, leaving a dark, permanent trail across the signature line. Sarah did not hesitate a second time. She pressed down, the scratch of the nib audible in the quiet office. With that final stroke, the weight of the debt shifted from a theoretical burden to a legal reality. The manager took the document, his movements efficient and practiced, and stamped the final page with a heavy, rhythmic thud. Sarah stood up, her legs feeling steady for the first time in an hour. She walked out of the bank and into the bright, unfiltered light of the street. The transition was immediate. Within days, the capital moved through the system, leaving the bank's ledger and manifesting as a deed to a commercial building. She stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the structure. It was weathered, the brickwork showing signs of neglect, but the foundation was solid. She reached out and pressed her palm against the rough surface of the exterior wall. It was cold and unyielding. She was no longer a person holding cash. The building loomed above her, a tangible asset. She turned away from the street, her pace purposeful, leaving behind the world of static savings. 10 years passed in a blur of seasons. In his small apartment, Mark followed a rigid rhythm. Every Friday, he opened his banking app, watched the digits rise by a few $100s, and closed the screen with a satisfied nod. He kept his spending to the bare minimum, tracking every cent in a leather-bound ledger. He never missed a deposit. Across town, the commercial building Sarah had purchased underwent a transformation. She spent her weekends on site, supervising repairs and meeting with potential tenants. When a pipe burst in the second-floor unit, she was there with a wrench, coordinating the fix before the water could damage the floorboards. She replaced the flickering exterior lights and repainted the lobby, turning the neglected space into a hub of activity. Her days were filled with the physical demands of ownership, signing leases, managing maintenance crews, and adjusting rent to match the shifting market. While Mark sat in his quiet office, Sarah was busy building a network of revenue. Sarah, meanwhile, had turned a single loan into a thriving asset. Mark sat at his desk, the office lights humming softly above him. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen illuminating his face in the dim room. With a practiced thumb, he tapped the banking app icon. The interface loaded, displaying the summary he had spent 15 years cultivating. He stared at the balance. It was higher than it had ever been. He scrolled through the transaction history, watching the steady, incremental climb of his savings. Every deposit was accounted for. Every cent was tracked. He felt the familiar weight of security settle in his chest. He tapped the screen to refresh the page, watching the numbers settle into place once more. To him, the total represented a decade of discipline and sacrifice. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and let out a slow, satisfied breath. He checked the interest accrual, noting the small but consistent additions. The math was simple, and the results were exactly what he had planned for. He felt the pride of a man who had done everything right. He stood up, stretched his arms, and looked out the window at the city skyline. He was ready to enjoy the fruits of his labor, unaware the value was slipping away. Mark stepped out into the afternoon air, his mind still anchored to the impressive balance he had just reviewed. He walked toward the local market, intending to pick up his usual supplies for a celebratory meal. The automatic doors slid open with a sharp hiss, and he stepped into the cool, fluorescent-lit aisle. He navigated the familiar path, passing the produce section and heading straight for the bakery rack. He reached for a loaf of bread, just as he had done for years. His hand paused mid-air. He looked at the tag. He blinked, then leaned in closer, his brow furrowing. The price was triple what it had been only a few months ago. He pulled the loaf from the shelf, turning it over to check the label, convinced he had grabbed a specialty item by mistake. He scanned the surrounding shelves. Every tag displayed the same inflated figures. He stood motionless in the aisle, the plastic packaging crinkling under his grip. The pride he felt only minutes ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp spike of confusion. He looked at the price again, then at the empty space where his budget used to fit. Across the city, the atmosphere was entirely different. Sarah stood in the polished marble lobby of the commercial building she had acquired a decade prior. She held a tablet, scrolling through the digital ledger as the monthly rent payments hit her account. One by one, the notifications chimed. The figures were significantly higher than they had been when she first signed the loan. She tapped the screen to view the summary, watching the incoming cash flow surpass her fixed mortgage payment with ease. The debt she had taken on remained static, a constant number frozen in time, while the revenue generated by the property continued to climb. She walked to the window, looking out over the district. The value of the building had soared, yet her financial obligation to the bank stayed exactly where it started. She checked the ledger again, confirming the surplus. It was a simple, brutal mechanism. The money from her tenants covered the bank's interest, while the remaining profit flowed directly into her control. She did not have to work harder to earn this. She simply held the asset. The system was performing exactly as she had designed it to. Back in his office, Mark stared at the screen, the balance of $240,000 mocking him. He tapped a calculator, subtracting the new, inflated costs of basic goods from his total. The result was a shrinking horizon. Every month that passed, the same amount of money bought fewer items. His savings were not just stagnant, they were actively losing their utility. He was holding on to a currency that the market was slowly discarding. Meanwhile, Sarah sat in her office, reviewing the terms of her original $1 million loan. The debt she owed to the bank was fixed, a static number established 10 years ago. Because of inflation, the money she would eventually use to pay off that loan was worth far less. She was essentially paying back the bank with cheaper dollars while her asset continued to generate higher returns. Mark was the source of the liquidity that fueled this cycle, his deposits providing the capital that banks lent to people like Sarah. He watched the numbers on his screen, the digits remaining the same while the world around him grew more expensive. The trap was clear. He realized that holding cash during an inflationary period was not a form of security, but a slow, systematic surrender of his own financial future. Sarah sat at her desk, the morning sun hitting the glass of her office building. She opened a real estate appraisal report that had arrived in her inbox. The numbers were clear. The property she had purchased a decade ago was now valued at $2 million. She leaned back, watching the city traffic below. Her net worth had effectively doubled, a gain realized not through extra hours or physical exertion, but through the simple act of ownership. While she slept, the market had adjusted, pushing the value of her asset upward to match the changing economic landscape. She checked the date, noting how much time had passed since she first signed the loan. The growth was consistent, a steady climb that ignored the daily fluctuations of the currency market. Across town, Mark was still tracking his pennies, his focus locked on the static balance of his bank account. He was trapped in a cycle of counting what he had. While Sarah was focused on what she could control, she watched the appraisal document, the $2 million figure standing as a testament to her strategy. The gap between them was no longer just about money. It was about the fundamental difference between holding a depreciating currency and owning an appreciating asset. Mark sat at his kitchen table, the stack of utility bills spread out before him. He pulled up his banking app, expecting the usual routine of simple deductions. He clicked to pay the electricity bill, but the screen flashed a warning. The amount due had jumped by 40% since last quarter. He frowned, his fingers tapping the screen with increasing force. He checked the gas, the water, and the property tax. Every single line item had climbed, creating a cumulative weight that his static balance could no longer support. He leaned back, his breath hitching in his chest. The numbers on the screen were no longer just digits. They were a countdown. He did the math again, his hands shaking as he realized the total. If he continued at this rate, his entire savings would be depleted in less than 3 years. The security he had spent 15 years building was dissolving in real time. He stood up, pacing the small room, his pulse thumping in his ears. The walls felt closer than they had a moment ago. He returned to the screen, staring at the balance. It represented a slow-motion collapse. He gripped the edge of the table, the wood biting into his palms, as the full weight of his vulnerability crashed down on him. Mark did not look away from the screen. He scrolled back, month by month, year by year. Thousands of entries. Every deposit was a piece of his time, his focus, his life. He had treated the bank as a vault, a place where his hard work would wait for him in safety. Now, the math stared back with brutal clarity. He had spent 15 years feeding a machine that grew stronger while he grew weaker. He tapped the screen, highlighting the interest earned over a decade. It was negligible, a pittance. He realized then that he had not been an investor. He had been a donor. His capital had been the fuel for loans, for mortgages, for the expansion of others. He looked at his hands, calloused from years of desk work and rigid discipline. He had traded his prime years for a currency that lost its value every single day he held it. The money had never worked for him. It had worked for the bank, and for the people who knew how to borrow it. He felt the weight of the phone in his palm, suddenly heavy, like a lead weight. He set the device down on the table, the screen still glowing, the balance mocking his years of sacrifice. The silence of the office was no longer peaceful. It was the sound of a wasted decade. Mark reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the news feed. The headlines were a barrage of cold, hard data. Central banks were hiking interest rates again. Asset prices in the commercial sector were hitting record highs. He scrolled faster, his eyes darting across the text. Each article confirmed the same reality. The cost of borrowing was rising, but the value of cash was plummeting. He clicked on a link detailing the surge in property valuations. The numbers were astronomical, a direct inverse to the stagnant digits in his own account. He felt the walls of his situation closing in. The system was not broken. It was operating exactly as intended. It penalized the stagnant and rewarded the bold. He saw a graph showing the widening gap between the wealthy and the savers. Every notification that pinged on his screen felt like a hammer strike against his past decisions. He was not just losing money, he was losing his place in the world. He stared at the glowing display, the blue light washing over his face. He was trapped in a dying cycle of his own making. Mark tapped into the bank's annual report, his eyes scanning the fine print of the lending disclosures. He traced the flow of capital. Deposits from savers like him were pooled, aggregated, and then deployed as high-leverage commercial loans. He looked at the dates. A large deposit he made a decade ago coincided perfectly with the funding of a major commercial real estate project across town. He saw the name of the district. It was the same one where Sarah had built her portfolio. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. His money had not been sitting in a vault. It had been working, just not for him. It had been the very liquidity the bank used to empower people like Sarah. He was the silent partner in an empire he had no stake in. Every cent he had saved was a brick in a wall that kept him out. The interest rates paid to him were microscopic compared to the returns generated by the assets his money had purchased for others. He had been funding the competition. He leaned back, the chair groaning under his weight, staring at the ceiling as the truth settled in. He was the primary financier of a system designed to extract his wealth. Across the city, Sarah stood on the sidewalk, her gaze fixed on the glass facade of the commercial tower. The building rose 20 stories, a monolith of steel and concrete that dominated the skyline. She watched the lobby doors swing open and shut, a steady stream of professionals entering the space that generated her wealth. There was no sweat on her brow, no calluses on her hands. She had not spent her days grinding through labor. She had spent them orchestrating debt. A notification buzzed in her pocket, warning of a market dip, but she did not even glance at the screen. She knew the mechanics of the game. The mortgage payments were covered by the rent, and the inflation that eroded cash only served to inflate the value of her holdings. She tapped her keycard against the reader, the lock clicking open with a sharp, mechanical finality. She stepped into the cool, climate-controlled air of the lobby. Her empire was silent, efficient, and growing. She had mastered the art of using other people's capital to secure her own future. Mark looked back at the screen. The balance read $240,000. It was the same number he had stared at for years. He stood up and walked to the local market, the air thick with the smell of fresh grain. He reached for a loaf of bread, but the price tag stopped him. It was triple what it had been 10 years ago. He looked at the shelf, then at his phone. The math was simple and brutal. Every hour he had spent working, every cent he had denied himself, was being systematically erased by the rising cost of existence. The money in his account was not a store of value. It was a melting block of ice. He walked back to his desk. He watched the app refresh, the number mocking him with its stability while the world outside grew more expensive by the second. The purchasing power he had worked 15 years to accumulate was evaporating in real time, leaving him with a hollow number. Mark stared at the glowing screen until his eyes burned. The realization hit him with the weight of a physical blow. He was not just a customer. He was the fuel for the very system that had drained his life's work. He tapped the screen, swiped the banking app into the trash, and felt the sudden, jarring silence of a digital void. He stood up, pacing the length of his office, the floorboards creaking under his weight. His hands were no longer trembling. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he had ignored for years, a financial advisor. He pressed the button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. He looked out the window at the city skyline, at the towers owned by people who understood the game, and felt the last vestiges of his old life slip away. The call connected. Mark took a breath, his grip tightening. He asked how to move his capital into assets that would survive the fire. The era of the passive observer was over. The phone call ended, but the silence in the office had changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of a man waiting for his fortune to rot. It was the sharp, electric stillness of a man who had finally stopped playing a rigged game. For 15 years, Mark had been a cog in the machine, providing the liquidity that allowed others to build empires while his own wealth withered. That era is dead. The model of the passive saver, the one who hides cash under a mattress of interest rates, has been exposed as a relic. Now, the new guard rises. The era of the allocator has begun. This is not about working harder or sacrificing more. It is about controlling the assets that dictate the flow of value. It is about using the system instead of being used by it. Mark was no longer a victim of inflation. He was a participant in the growth that outpaces it. Will you continue to watch your wealth shrink in the shadows of a dying system, or will you take the wheel and build something that lasts? Mark sat back down, but he did not look for comfort. He pulled a fresh notepad from his drawer, the paper crisp and empty. He began to map out the flow of capital, tracing the path from his stagnant accounts into the veins of the economy. Every mistake he had made in the last 15 years became a data point, a lesson in what to avoid. He studied the market trends, the interest rates, and the asset classes he had once feared as risks. Now, he saw them as tools. He realized that the system was not a predator, but a landscape, and he had simply been standing in the wrong place. He was no longer waiting for the clock to tick away his value. He was calculating, measuring, and planning his first move into the market. The fear of loss had been replaced by the hunger for growth. He opened a new portal, not for savings, but for allocation. He was not just surviving, he was starting over with the advantage of experience. He picked up his pen, marked his first target, and began to build. The lesson is written in the numbers. You have seen the path of the saver, a slow descent into the erosion of value, and the path of the allocator, a climb toward lasting control. The choice is no longer theoretical. Every day you wait, the system extracts the value you have worked to create. It is a quiet theft, hidden in the steady rise of prices and the slow decay of purchasing power. You can remain where you are, watching the digits stay the same. Or you can step out of the shadows. You can stop funding the empires of others and begin the work of building your own. The tools are available. The rules are clear. The only variable remaining is your own decision to act. Will you continue to watch your wealth shrink as the tide of inflation rises? Or will you use the system to build something that lasts? The clock is ticking. What will you do?